questioning mind is good for all, right? And I know, I'm very sure that all of you have a lot of questions. So here I have with me today Yashaswini of class 6 from Parikrama. She has a question for the speakers of the session today, which is Gutschow and Disket Angmo. So please go ahead and ask them your question.
Kim and Disket Akka, you work on climate change solution in the high Himalayas in Ladakh. Must be so cold there, Akka. Isn't global warming good for people there?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And you might think getting warmer in a cold place would be an improvement. But the raising temperatures means not only less snowfall, but in fact that the glaciers are shrinking, and the glaciers are the source of water, and water is life in Ladakh. So in fact, it is a difficult situation. People are adapting, and there are lots of innovative solutions that we'll be talking about today, but climate change is happening and glaciers are melting, and the predictions vary, but generally the science suggests that in this century, we will be losing a lot of glaciers and permanent snowfields across Ladakh as across the wider Himalayan and Hindu Kush region. But thanks. Shall I start by sharing my screen, Akash?
Yes, doctor, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for answering the question.
Okay, so Akash, I didn't quite hear that. Shall I start my presentation?
Yes, doctor, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's see. Work. Here we are. Okay, so I'm Kim Gutschow, senior lecturer at Williams College in the US, and I'm going to be presenting on our project, ClimateZ Zanskar, by the people and for the people, which is based on 33 years of work in the Ladakh region of the Indian Himalaya. My collaborator is Disket Angmo. Disket? Well, yeah, there we are. You want to introduce yourself briefly? You're muted. Disket? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so my name is Disket Angmo and I work with Kim. I am her research assistant for ClimateZ Zanskar by the people and for the people project.
Thank you. And Disket is going to talk a bit in the slideshow, but I just want to commend her in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Last summer, that is in 2021, Disket went to Zanskar and was able to begin our fieldwork and focus group discussions and met a lot of really interesting youth activists, climate change influencers, and innovators in Zanskar who are going to be working with our project. So basically, Disket was like the advanced team to work with our other team members in Zanskar. So thank you. Right, so the three goals of our project are to look at and to describe as well as illustrate and tell the story of Zanskar for a wider Indian audience, a wider audience across the HKH region, that is the Himalayan Hindu Kush region, which spans 10 countries in Asia, and the wider world. And we are looking at the sustainable, regenerative agro-pastoralism that is practiced in Zanskar, the remarkable land and gender equity and system of rights, indigenous rights, that are being championed in Ladakh, and the innovative landscape management that Ladakhis are already practicing, even as they are adapting to climate change. So I'll be talking about these in detail, but just to give an example, innovative solutions might be the ice stupas that you see up here on the right. The land and gender equity is expressed by the fact that women not only own land, but many households in Ladakh are female-headed, and they have a lot of agency and autonomy and equal power, you might say, as men do in many areas of Ladakhi society. And here you see sort of a schematic map of what a landscape management plan might look like that we are going to be developing. So where do we work? We are working in the HKH region, that is the Himalayan Hindu Kush region, which is home to 294 million people. It spans the countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, China, the region of Tibet, Thailand, and Burma, and Bhutan. Now, It is composed of several major watersheds, one of which is the Indus, that's outlined here in blue, and the Indus watershed being one of the largest watersheds in Asia, spans not only India and Pakistan, but for the purposes of our project, we are working in the upper Indus basin, that is the uppermost part of the Indus watershed. And Zanskar is basically a small region of about 7,000 square kilometers that lies along a major tributary of the Indus River, that is the Zanskar River. So, why is Zanskar special? Well, our project, in a sense, is telling the story, telling and co-creating, you might say, a story of sustainable livelihoods in the Zanskar region. Now, the Zanskar region, as I said, is about 7,000 square kilometers, but it only is home to 15,000 people. So that's, you do your math, it's about 2 people per square kilometer. That makes it one of the least inhabited areas of all India, outside of the Rajasthani desert regions. That is to say, we are in a high altitude desert. It is scarcely populated, but it is very intensively cultivated. So while 99% of the Zanskari landmass is uninhabited and uncultivatable, and as you can see, the desert region that is outside the boundaries of this village is either desert, as in no access to water, or it is steep scree slopes and granite slopes, or it is glaciers and snowfields. In short, a lot of the land can't be inhabited, but that which is very intensively cultivated, primarily with the crops of barley, wheat, and peas. And each village has a set of houses, and most houses have access to land. So this is, again, very different from much of North India, which is the other part of India where I've worked. In much of North India, 90% of the population lacks access to land, does not own land, and 10% maybe owns the land. In Zanskar, 99% of the households own land and farm the fields that they own. And what this does is it makes for a very unique system whereby almost everybody is engaged not only in owning land and farming that land, but in producing their own food. That is, it's not all the food that they eat. It is maybe only a fraction of the food that a household is eating, but it is an important piece of it. So how is the Zanskari food being produced? Well, one of the things that our project is examining is this genius of the Zanskari irrigation system. It is a system based on need, not greed. And what that means is it is the need of the field, of the crop, of the user, rather than the greed of the owner, the village, the institution, or the corporation, which is the case for much of the irrigation that we find across the US or elsewhere in India. That is to say, these fields are being irrigated by a shared system of water stewardship, where individual households or groups of households or even entire villages are sharing water according to rotation patterns that have been practiced for centuries and that actually work, not only because there's very little conflict around water, but because of the way they're irrigating. So what this schematic map up in the upper left shows is how an individual field is watered. That is to say, it is watered section by section, and these sections, these square sections, are called nang or rooms, and you can see them in the actual field here. So this picture was taken when Garkit, my roommate in Karsha, where I lived, and we were irrigating this field in May many years ago. And section by section, the field is being irrigated according to this pattern, which you can see in October. After the field is harvested, you see the pattern still in the earth of that irrigation process. And why I call it a genius irrigation system is because the 1-month-old seedlings are being delicately flooded with water in a way that minimizes erosion, minimizes soil loss, and retains the nutrients that the field needs. So the field is a living entity that exchanges nutrients and elements like oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus with the landscape around it, and it is retained in the soil. This is one of the reasons that fields can be continuously cultivated in Zanskar. So almost no fields are left fallow or rarely left fallow, and these fields have been continuously cultivated for about 1,600 years. That is 1,600 years. The village of Karsha was first inhabited between the 2nd and 4th century CE. So here's the village of Kumik. And what we see is the impact of declining water. So the very question that I was asked at the beginning of this presentation, what happens when the temperature is increasing? Isn't warmth a good thing for a cold region? Well, it turns out not so much. If the glaciers are melting and the permanent snowfields are also melting, there's less water in the tributary streams. And the result of that, you see here on the left, the village of Kumik, at its bottom end, many of the fields are left fallow. So that those are the circular regions that are brown, not green, surrounded by a few fields that are still being cultivated. But after about 30 years of a dramatic loss of the glacier that has been accelerating throughout the 20th century, the villagers of Kumik decided and did a dramatic thing. They actually abandoned these fields in their village that are being left fallow, and they went down to the river plain of the Zanskar River, that is to say the alluvial plain, and they built new irrigation channels with the help of the government and even bulldozers. It took them 10 years to build new channels and new fields. And yet those fields, if you look at this desert soil, are still hardly as rich as the fields in Kumik that they left behind. So what you have is, yes, the potential to shift to a new area where you might be able to create new fields and new irrigation channels. The only problem is those fields will be largely glacial silt, and they will be very scarce in nutrients. So they will not be as fertile and produce very low crop yields. Now, to describe a little bit more of the labor-intensive agriculture of the Zanskari agro-pastoral system, I'm going to show a few slides to just sort of illustrate how it is that people are essentially growing their own food and managing their environment. So this is the harvest of barley and wheat. Those are two major crops that are growing at 3,500 meters above sea level. And you see whole families will go out, and it's very labor intensive, not only to harvest the barley by pulling up the stalks from their roots, but one has to do it with a group of people. Why? Because the crops are not only ripped out of the ground, but then they have to be transported to the household, which is nearby, before they rot in the fields, let's say, because the soil might be still moist. It has had one last watering to make it easier to rip out the plants, but also because the grains of barley are valuable, that if they're left out in the field after they've been harvested, the birds would eat them. So you stack the barley that you've harvested in a specific way, then you carry it to the household. You are cutting not only the, you're not only ripping out the barley and the wheat, but cutting the alfalfa that grows along the edges of the field. This is the ol. Every bit of green that is basically grown and irrigated in Zanskar is used in some fashion. So while barley and wheat produce the grains that will be eaten by people, it is the ol that is the fodder for the cows and yaks and zos, and the zo is a yak cow crossbreed in the wintertime. Now, besides, after the harvest, there are further steps before you have food on your plate. The barley has to be threshed and the wheat. So threshing, what is threshing? Threshing is the process by which the grains are separated from the stalks. So remember I said the entire plant is ripped out. So it's brought and laid horizontally in circles, and a group of zo, and the zo are a little bit more docile than the yak. So the yak is not really great for threshing. So you tie up a bunch of zo, usually 6 to 8 of them, and you march them in a circle around and around for an entire day on top of the barley or wheat plants. And the trampling of their hooves separates the grains from the chaff. The chaff is the stalks. That will later be food for those same zo in the wintertime. Now, the barley, having been trampled by animals in the dust, is rather dirty, so it has to be washed. This is what's happening over here on the left. And after it's washed, it is roasted. So the roasting, well, I'll get to that in a second, but let's first switch to the pastoral system. So you are grazing yaks and zoe at high pastures. Over here on the left, you can see this is a yak that belongs to one of the households down in the village that is about 4 or 5 kilometers away. And it is a person who has brought this yak up to high pasture. The yaks are strong enough. They don't have natural predators, certainly in the summer months. In the winter, yes, the snow leopard is a predator, but in the summer, the wolves will not attack a yak. So the yak stays up on the high pasture all summer. It doesn't need that much attention. But the sheep and the goats, the smaller animals, every day they are taken out to graze on the pastures around a village, and every evening they are brought back in for a night in the stables because they would be eaten by wolves and other predators. So here we have, after I said the barley is washed, the further processing. It is roasted over a fire to make something called tsampa. That is a roasted barley is a food, staple food in Ladakh. You can grind it into a flour and then just eat it with your tea in the morning or when you're out in the fields and working. It is also used for making tukpa, which is a soup in the morning. And the wheat that is homegrown is used for making breads. And what you do notice in terms of these images that I've shown thus far is that many of the people doing of this agrarian work are women. It is not just because women are exceptionally skilled at all these tasks, and they are. It's not just because they're very hard workers, and yes, they are, but it is because a lot of the men are outside the region, either working in jobs in government service or in the army. And many of the government service jobs, and certainly the army jobs, are still widely accessible to men and not so much to women. But women are nurses and teachers, and many women are doing multiple jobs. So they may have a government job and they also do some farming on the side. So now to our project. Very briefly, this is a screenshot of our website. And if you're interested, you can go. Our website is down below. I think this presentation will be recorded, or certainly the Parikrama folks can give you the website if you'd like to look a little bit more at what we're doing. And what I've just described is this genius of the Zanskar agro-pastoral system. Our project is not only, as I said, illustrating and disseminating via the website and other social media. We'll be disseminating sort of our findings, but we are interested in working with Zanskari women and youth in terms of the threats to the system that are a part of climate change. So you have a climate of increasing aridity. That is one major threat, which I have said a little bit about. You have labor scarcity, which has been exacerbated after COVID-19, although it was already present there before. And you have the shifting politics that happened after 2019, when the Indian government took the unprecedented step of canceling Article 370 of the Indian Constitution and creating and canceling the statehood of Jammu and Kashmir, thereby creating 2 new union territories, including Ladakh Union Territory. And Disket is going to talk a bit about that. And all of those 3 threats impact one major issue, that is food security, which is a central issue for our project. Now, briefly, to talk about the specifics of climate change in the HKH region, or Hindu Kush Himalaya. So we know the glaciers are shrinking. We have data from across this region, and the map, the charts here on the graph, the red bars are showing in meters how much glaciers have shrunk. This is in the central Himalayas. This would be where Nepal is. And then over here, we have the Western Himalayas. And the yellow circle is actually where we are working. So in Zanskar and Ladakh. And you see, there's actually very little data in that region. But even without the data, we do know from some studies, and when I say data, I mean long-term studies specifically of individual glaciers that are shown to be shrinking here. These red bars are how much they're shrinking. But we do know from some studies by the University of Kashmir that 2/3 of Zanskar's 212 glaciers and permanent snowfields had already receded by 2003, resulting in an 8% loss of total glacial area. we also know that Zanskar has warmed roughly 3 degrees Fahrenheit in the past century. That's about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, over on the right, we see a study from the Tibetan Plateau that shows the temperature increase in degrees Celsius between 1961 and 1990. So that's a 30-year period. And what's most remarkable is that the increase is far less at lower altitudes, that is between 0 and 1,000 meters above sea level. And the increase is much higher at the higher altitudes, such as above 3,000 meters. In fact, between 3,000 and 4,000, it is almost the highest. And that's exactly where Zanskar villages are located, at around 3,500 meters. And what's notable about this chart is it ends in 1990. So folks, if you're paying attention, it's been 30 years since 1990. And in fact, the chart would continue off, you might say, the graph here. And you might expect, if this was a pattern that was predictive of the next 30 years, that there would be another 0.3 increase in Celsius. So Disket, over to you. Disket is going to talk about labor scarcity and the political shifts.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Okay, so Kim just talked about how about climate change and how that is presenting as threat to the land and livelihood of people in Zanskar. But I'm going to talk about two other threats, that is labor security and the shifting political system in Ladakh. So starting with the labor scarcity and the out-migration for education and work. So what does labor scarcity mean? It means that there are less and less people at home who are working at the fields. And this summer we went to Zanskar, we did the research on this project, and we found out that there are labor scarcity because the students are going outside of Zanskar for higher educational purpose. And speaking from my own experience, I am native Ladakhi, and after 10th standard, there's no good schools and universities at Ladakh. So you are compelled to go outside of India, outside of Ladakh to study, and even outside of India. And in my case, I did my 11th and 12th standard in Pune. And then after that, I went to United States, and now I am studying in Nepal. So that is like one classic examples of how, due to not having good facilities in Ladakh, students are, after 10th standard, mostly going outside of Ladakh, which is why, which is a different case as compared to my grandparents' generation, because my grandparents and my fathers, during their generation, they would be in our villages, and school wasn't that mandatory, and cash economy or office jobs wasn't that mandatory. People were mostly just farming, which means there were more laborers at home, which means there were more people working at the field. However, those things are changing. Students like me are going outside of Ladakh for education and also for jobs. People are also leaving Ladakh and also living mostly the villages and going to the Leh, which is the main city of Ladakh. And also for healthcare reason, people are going to Delhi and like other cities for better healthcare reasons. So all of these factors are making people leave Ladakh, which means that now there is a scarcity of labor at home, and which is why like 20 years ago, let's say if you have like 20 fields, you would cultivate all the 20 fields. But now, due to the scarcity of laborers, you will only do maybe 3 or 4 research. That's what we learned about that. And Kim, do you wanna?
Yeah, next slide. Yeah,
next
slide.
Yeah. And now this slide, we are gonna talk about the changing political system in Ladakh. So before 2019, Ladakh was part of Jammu and Kashmir state. And in 2019, the Indian government declared Ladakh as Union territory. And what that means is that now it is not part of, Ladakh is not part of Jammu and Kashmir anymore. And with the Union territory status, the Indian government removed the Article 370 and Article 35. So what these articles are, the 370, these are laws. Both of these are laws. These articles are laws that provide special autonomy for indigenous people, like having your own ownership of the land and not allowing outsiders to come and set their own private businesses, or not allowing outsiders to have the ownership of the land, and having your own, safeguarding your own culture, your identity, job security. So these articles gave autonomy over land and resources. But however, since those articles have been revoked, and now due to the new status of union territory, now there is the possibilities of outsiders coming in and setting their own private businesses, more modern development, more factories, more roads. So what that could all mean for Ladakhi natives, or what does that mean for the melting glaciers? What does that mean? So because of all these uncertainties, natives are facing a lot of anxieties regarding their own identity. What will happen to them? What will happen to the land ownership? What will happen to the ownership over the water, the plantations, the job security? So all of these things are making native people really anxious, and that is why native people are demanding for 6 scheduled, which is a law in that Indian Constitution grant, especially for native people. So places like Assam, Meghalaya, and there are 10 different tribal regions in India that has this status of 6 schedule. So what this does is, when you are under 6 scheduled constitution, then you have special autonomy over your own land. You have job security. You have you can protect your culture, your identity. So there is many safeguards for native peoples. That is why people of Ladakh are demanding for that. And also we are demanding for that because 97% of Ladakhi population is tribal, which is one of the category that you need to come under 6 schedule protection. That is why people are demanding for 6 schedule, so that there is better protection for people, and also overall better protection for the glacier and everything. And then Kim will talk about the next slide.
Yes, thank you, Disket. And in the question and answer, feel free to ask Disket and me any follow-up questions of what you heard. So we have just 2 more slides. This is when we work, and this is a brief illustration of agrarian and Tibetan time. So not only is Zanskar a special place, I say a genius place. It has this unique and very sophisticated genius agro-pastoral livelihood system, but it has a fascinating agrarian time that's mapped here, and all of these tasks that I was describing, that is the planting of barley, the bringing livestock to high pasture, the irrigation channels, the weeding, the watering, the dung collecting, and so forth, the harvest. They are mapped on this time scale, this circle, which shows spring in green, summer in yellow, fall in maroon, and winter in blue. And that seasonal or agrarian time is related to the Tibetan months of the year, which are mapped here on this inner circle. against the Gregorian months that you all know, and the seasons yet again, as exhibited by the period from winter solstice to spring equinox to summer solstice to autumn equinox. And below you have the Tibetan time. And for those of you that don't know it, Losarla Tashidele, it was Losar, Tibetan Losar, that is Tibetan New Year Day on March 1st, just a few days ago. It was the beginning of the water tiger year. And now we're done with our presentation. So our project has 3 prongs. It has a storytelling aspect, it has a research aspect, and it has an activist aspect. What would you do if you were helping with our project in Zanskar, maybe a few years from now, or if you were running your own project in Ladakh or the wider Himalayan Hindu Kush region? What would you do as a storyteller, a researcher, or an activist? And what other questions might you have for me? And for Disket? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a whole lot of information. Now I'm very sure our kids already have questions lined up. So I'm going to read a few questions.
Okay.
Give me just a second while we get the questions.
Sure. And is it okay if I'll keep the slides up, so if the students have questions, I can go back to the slide?
Sure, no problem.
Okay. It's early in the morning. Maybe everybody's, and I don't see the chat. I could go to the chat, but, when was the Tibetan Losar? March 1st. Okay, I love it that everybody's telling us what they will be. Researcher, storyteller, activist. Wonderful.
Okay, there's one question here. What kind of agricultural prevention will be implemented in regions such as Hindu Kush, where climate change will affect vastly?
Okay, yeah, great question. I didn't speak specifically about what exactly the adaptations in agriculture. So one, because the temperature is increasing in a place like Zanskar, suddenly crops that were only grown in the neighboring Ladakh region can now be grown in Zanskar. That is, things like apricots, apples. And apricot is actually a major export crop for Ladakh. It is in the crores of rupees that Ladakh benefits from the apricot harvest. They are exported throughout northern India, and you might have even run across dried apricots or apricot jam or other products made from the chuli and the pating, which are the names of the Ladakhi apricot. Maybe you found them in a store in Bangalore. So you can introduce different crops, new seeds. You can certainly adapt and strengthen and rebuild the irrigation channels. But there will also be other innovations yet to be discovered, we might say. And maybe youth will be part of that. Another question.
All right, so there's another question that says, why did you choose to work for a place in Asia?
That's a great question. Well, after college, I spent 2 years in Thailand working with Southeast Asian refugees, so Laotians, Cambodians, and Vietnamese. And in that time, because I was working with people who had fled Laos and fled the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, so the stories I was hearing, I was helping basically as a paralegal, refugees find asylum in third countries. And in that time, these stories of war and of death and really incredible loss, absolutely traumatic loss, day in, day out, I took a short sabbatical. And for 2 months, I went to Ladakh. And it was so amazing. I was so fascinated. And I have an attraction, I guess, to high mountain regions. I live in a much lower mountain region in New England. That's where I'm from. But what attracted me to Ladakh most was, you might say, the Buddhist culture, the landscape, and then the kernels of this project, which are to say an amazing interdependent and coexistent kind of livelihood where people really are caring for the planet Earth and all the sentient beings that are part of that planet. That is the plants and all the animals. I mean, literally from bugs in the soil up to, all the animals that we see and are more maybe attracted to, like wolves and bears and hawks and snow leopards. So that's what drew me. And I learned Ladakhi after a few years, and I ended up spending 14 years living in a Buddhist nunnery. I wrote my PhD dissertation, and all of that time I was also studying and working with people in the fields. And so beginning this process that I'm still engaged with the ClimateZ. Now, there was another question that said, are there artificial methods of preventing glacier melt? And I'm going to say no. I have a friend, Elizabeth Colbert is her name. She wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Sixth Extinction. If you haven't read it, you should. But she wrote another book called Under a White Sky, which is about these geotechnical solutions, like trying to seed clouds, and maybe that will, help prevent climate change, or slow the calcification, the acidification of the ocean that prevents the calcium and the shells and the coral reefs. Well, a lot of these geoengineered solutions end up producing, I would say, more problems than they prevent. So I'm a bit suspicious of them, I will say. Other questions? Mahesh, do you want to read?
Okay, there's another question here. Have there been any record-breaking cold and snowfall in the last few decades, and how do these events affect the acceptance of climate change, especially from the authority?
Okay, yes, great question. Now, I don't have sort of the annual snowfall at the top of my head, and maybe I would turn this even to Disket, but I'm going to say briefly that the snowfall varies quite a bit. And what's more dramatic, so you might have winters with a lot of snow. In Disket, you could speak to this. I think we had a lot of snow in Zanskar even last November, but that's not as significant. That snow, it may fall and it may be even significant, in a specific seasonal time. But that temperature increase that I was showing on the chart, what that does is not only hasten the melting of the snow pack in the spring, but it melts these permanent snowfields or glaciers. And the difference between glacier and a permanent snowfield, it's very subtle. You might not even recognize it, but a glacier is simply that which is left over from the last ice age, which is to say 40,000 years ago, and a permanent snowfield is that which has been formed as almost permanent ice over the last thousands of years. So both of those water storage towers, they're called literally sort of the water towers of Asia, they are shrinking, and that science is very clear, and that's what's producing the most impact. Now, what you might have also heard of, though, is something called a GLOF, a glacial lake outburst flood, and those are happening even in places like Uttarakhand and sort of the lower middle Himalayan region. And they, in fact, even just a few weeks ago, there was another massive flood. I think it was in Uttarakhand. And those are the result of, it can be extreme cloudbursts and rain, or it can be sediment that has blocked a narrow passageway behind which a glacial lake has formed suddenly through the melting of the frozen soil and earth that is blocking that lake and damming it, you might say. When that bursts because of the melting, then you get these massive floods in the Himalayas. So I don't know if that directly answered that question. Disket, do you want to talk about whether people in Ladakh are not believing in climate change because there's more snowfall one winter? I'd love to hear your perspective.
I think like when I went to Zanskar this summer for the research, many people are believing in climate change because when you look at the top of the mountain, the quantity of snow has reduced a lot, and you can see more mountains and less snow. Before it was like a lot of snow. So for local people, just like that, it can be an example. Oh, climate change is happening because 20 years ago, in this past, there were so many like snow, but now it's not. So that was one of the things that people were just saying, like the local people, um, yeah, farmers. That's what they were answering.
Thank you. Other questions?
All right. So someone here asked, Dr. Kim, as participants of the Parikrama Festival of Science, what can we do to help, or how can we make an impact on the melting glaciers in Ladakh?
Well, that's a great question. And the first step, I would say, is to attend these festivals, study your science, and think about, where do your skills lie? So is it as a storyteller, and you see that I tried to a little bit, it's very compressed in a presentation like this, but tell the stories of either the fields or a village that had to shift location, or how does this irrigation work and what is the genius of that Zanskar irrigation system. So telling a story is one way of actually making a difference, because you spread knowledge, you spread awareness. Researching, studying data, gathering the data, presenting the data, visualizing the data. And I did a little of that in terms of the data on the shrinking glaciers, but because our project is just launched last summer, we were supposed to start in 2020, but COVID prevented us from going. So we ended up creating the website. Anyway, the long story is we haven't gathered as much data as we want. So I didn't actually present a lot of the data that we hope to gather. So researchers will gather data, and through their data, they will either show the science of the change, but I think even more important is to actually study the innovations or the adaptations and show how they work. That is, we know the climate is changing. What we really know less about is actually, what are people doing in individual villages to adapt? So one thing you could do is, study research skills and then go and work in areas. And it might not be Ladakh, it might be a place closer to home. There you are in Bangalore, there's a water crisis happening in Chennai. That's not so far away. There is water shortages all over the south of India, even though it might look like there's a fair amount of water. And Bangalore is actually a little better equipped. But I was just reading a study 2 days ago that talked about 5 or 10 cities in India, and some of them are mega cities like Delhi, Ahmedabad, Chennai is one of them, that are going to have extreme water shortages even by 2030. So one way you can help is working on that. And that's that last piece. Be an activist. Spread the word. Work to save either water or, steward your own corner of the planet. That might be your household, that could be your neighborhood, that could be your school. You could start a club that is focused around climate change. There are many, many things you could do. And the youth are the innovators, and they're absolutely the future. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much once again, Akash. So I'd like to just tell all of you that due to time constraints, we'll not be able to answer all your questions. But what you can do instead is mail us your questions, and we'll make sure the questions reach the speakers and they'll answer them for you. For now, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation.